The town would stop calling the Jackson farm cursed. Mabel didn't know that yet. She only knew the apple trees were carrying less fruit every season, and that the men who had come to look at her irrigation had each left without saying much. Nelson and Briggs among them. She had started to believe them. That was the part she couldn't forgive herself for, because she had known where the problem was for 2 years. She walked the North Line every spring the way Robert had taught her, and the way she had improved on what he'd taught her. And she had found it. The section below the second drainage post where the soil stayed wrong too long after rain, where the grade flattened and the water backed instead of moved. The North Line was meant to do both jobs, carry water in during the dry weeks and carry it off after hard rain. When it failed, the west field drowned first and dried wrong after. She had taken a spade to it twice, gotten down far enough to confirm something had given way in the line. She could not dig it out alone, could not hold the trench and manage the upstream pressure and relay the pipe by herself, and the money that would have paid someone qualified to do it was the money the failing farm was no longer generating. She had covered it back over both times and gone inside and started supper. The men had come. They had stood where she told them to stand, looked where she told them to look, and said dry season and hard luck and gone home. She had stopped asking. What she had not done was stopped knowing. David Walker came into town on a Thursday in late April, when the cottonwoods along the creek road were just coming into leaf. He stopped because his horse needed water, and he needed a meal, and the saloon was the only building with a light still burning past 8. He took a stool at the far end of the bar and ate without talking to anyone. He was most of the way through his plate when he became aware of the conversation at the round table near the back wall. 3 men with their chairs pulled close and their voices arranged to be private, which in a quiet room meant he could hear them clearly enough. They were talking about a farm, a widow's place north of town, the water line failing, the orchard yield dropping every season. One of them mentioned what that acreage would go for, per acre, specific, the kind of number a man produces without looking it up, and nobody reacted like it was a strange thing to know. The other 2 nodded with the ease of men discussing something they have already decided. David had come west fixing other men's water, and he knew the difference between bad luck and a trap. He finished his plate. He turned his coffee cup once in his hands, then set it down. He ordered a second cup and stayed at the bar longer than he'd planned. He rode past the Jackson farm the next morning before he did anything else. What he saw was not a failing farm. What he saw was some of the best positioned soil in the valley being slowly strangled by a collapsed line. The apple trees were rooted in clay that would hold water better than most if the line were running right. The west field had a natural grade that, properly channeled, would nearly work by itself. He knew what land looked like when it had been left to fail on purpose. This land looked like that. He sat on his horse at the fence a while, reading the ground. Then he rode back toward town to find out how to approach the widow Jackson without sounding like every other man who had come to tell her what was wrong. She was in the yard when he came up the track. A woman in a dark work dress, hair pinned back, a bucket of feed grain on her hip. She stopped and waited with the stillness of someone who has learned that most arrivals cost something. A boy appeared at the porch rail, 12 maybe, with his mother's coloring and the serious face of a child who has been the man of something longer than suited him. David dismounted at the gate and took his hat off. He told her his name and that he had ridden past her land that morning and thought he knew what was wrong with her water line. She set the grain bucket down. her arms folded. The men I've hired thought they knew too. Below the second drainage post on the north line. He kept his voice even. The grade flattens there. The line's collapsed. It can't carry water in or off anymore, and your west field is paying for it both ways. Mabel Jackson looked at him. Not the look of a woman weighing whether to trust a stranger, but the look of someone who has been told something true after a long time of being told things that weren't. "That's where I thought it was," she said. "It is?" She was quiet a moment. "What are you asking?" He told her. He would fix what he'd found. He would sleep in the barn. He would ask nothing else. When the work was done, he'd move on. She looked at him a long time. The boy had come down off the porch steps and was standing beside her now. "All right," she said. She picked up the grain bucket and went back to the chickens. The boy stayed at the gate. "I'm Will." He offered his hand the way a man would. "David." He shook it. "You know your way around a trench?" "Some. You'll know more by the time we're done." Will held the gate open, and David led his horse through. They started on the north line the first week of May, the ground still carrying the cold of a late spring. Mabel came out at first light with 2 cups from the stove and set one on the fence post near him without a word, then went to open the orchard gate. He worked without urgency and without wasted motion. When he opened the trench below the second post, and the collapse showed itself exactly where she had said it would be. He crouched over it with both hands in the soil. He looked up at her. "How long have you known?" 2 years. He nodded and went back to the trench. She told him where to open the orchard ground, and he followed her direction without question. He had the tools and the understanding of water and pressure and grade. She had grown up watching this particular soil, the way it drained after a hard rain, where the frost came hardest, what the clay did in a dry spell. He seemed to understand the difference without being told. He listened, and he dug. By the second week, Will was beside him every morning, asking questions David answered in full. The actual answer, not the version stripped of its complications. Will already knew things. He knew them because Mabel had taught him, and the accuracy of what he knew settled somewhere in David without comment, the way a level settles when the bubble finds center. By late May, the north line was relayed and running clean. By June, the west field was moving water the way the grade had always meant it to. When the first real summer rain came, and the field held it properly for the first time in 3 years, Mabel stood at the edge of it in the gray morning with her boots in the wet grass. She went back to the house and made breakfast. June was when Julia said something. She was leaning across the fabric bolts at Heller's when Mabel came in, her voice already arranged to sound like concern. "People are starting to talk, Mabel. A man sleeping in your barn all spring." Mabel set her bolt of cotton on the counter. She looked past Julia to Heller behind the register, polishing a jar that was already clean. Heller had kept accounts in this town long enough to know when men were calling a thing cursed because they wanted it cheap. She had always suspected he knew more than he said. "Robert hired men every spring before he got sick." She kept her eyes on Heller. "Nobody talked then." Julia straightened. That was different. It was. Mabel picked up the cotton and moved toward the register. "He had a wife." She paid and left. By the following week she could feel it in town. Glances that lasted a half-second too long, conversations that quieted in a particular way. She felt it and noted it and went on with what needed doing. The orchard came in heavy in September, branch after branch of fruit, the smell of it sharp and cold in the early morning air. Will climbed the loading ladder and passed crates down without saying anything. Once, when Mabel looked up, he was grinning at the tree above him the way he used to grin at things before Robert died. She looked away before he could see her looking. David worked the harvest alongside them without comment on the yield. She had put the good cloth out the night before the first picking, the one from the cedar chest, the one she'd used to wrap the bread she'd sent to the barn that first morning. After the harvest supper, she found it on the porch rail, washed and folded into a square. She stood looking at it. She went inside. The west field stood the following spring, a full stand of grain where there had been 3 years of failure, and it was that, more than the orchard, that made the town start asking questions. What came out was not complicated. Each time Nelson or Briggs had come to look at the Jackson farm, they had understood exactly what the water line needed and said nothing, because the land they called cursed was the land they had been waiting to take at a reduced price. One of them had spoken to a land broker in the county seat the week after his second visit. It was Heller who told her, on a Tuesday in March, standing in her doorway with his hat in both hands. He had the look of a man who has carried something too long and knows it. She listened to all of it. When he finished, she said, "Thank you, Howard." He left. She sat at the kitchen table for a long time. The stove ticked, the chickens moved in the yard. Outside, she could hear Will's voice, and then David's, something about the east fence grade, the boy asking and the man answering, and the anger in her chest was clean and cold. Not the anger of surprise, the anger of confirmation, which is different and carries a different weight. She had not been fooled. She had been outmaneuvered. She had waited 3 years for the difference to matter. She found David at the workbench in the barn an hour later, fitting a valve to the east branch of the line. She stood in the doorway until he looked up. She told him what Heller had said. He set the valve down. The quiet that followed was different from his usual quiet. Something behind it he was not going to perform. Then he picked the valve back up and turned it in his hands. "I heard them in the saloon that first night, talking about the acreage price." She looked at him. "Then you already knew what they were." "I knew what kind of men they were." He set the valve on the bench. "I didn't know the rest of it until just now." She went back to the house and started supper. He came in when the light outside had gone blue, washed his hands at the pump, and sat down at the table without being asked. She put a plate in front of him. Will sat between them and talked about the east fence, and the two of them answered him in turns. The harvest was in by the 3rd week of October, the trees stripped and resting, the air carrying the smell of fallen apples, and the first real cold underneath it. They had walked the north row together after supper, the way they sometimes did, checking the root zone mostly, or saying they were. He stopped walking before she did. She took another step, realized it, and turned back. He was looking at the orchard the way he looked at work he had finished, and found good, not pride, something quieter. The settling of a man who has done what he came to do and is not in a hurry to leave it. He looked at her. "I want to stay on." He kept his voice level. "Not as a hired man. Permanently. This land is as good as any I've worked, and Will's got another few years before he can run it the way it needs running, and by then I'd like to know it the way you know it." He paused. "I'd like to know it with you." He reached into his coat pocket and held out his hand. In his palm was a plain iron ring, worn smooth, Not new, the kind of thing a man carries a long time before he knows what it's for. "Will you marry me?" She looked at the ring. She looked at him, at the steadiness of him, the same steadiness that had been in the trench and at the workbench and at her kitchen table, the kind that does not perform itself because it has never needed to. Her throat moved. "The boy already thinks you're staying," she said. "He stopped asking weeks ago." The corner of his mouth shifted. Not quite a smile, the acknowledgement of one. She reached out and took the ring from his palm. "Yes," she said. He closed her hand around it with both of his and held it there a moment, not long, just long enough, and then let go. They stood in the orchard a little longer, and then walked back toward the house through the long October light. They married in June. Heller gave a brief toast. Will stood beside David at the front of the room with his hair combed and his boots polished, and the expression on his face was the one he'd been wearing since October, when he'd come in from the orchard and found them already back at the house and not looking at each other too carefully. By the following season, the Jackson farm was producing more per acre than most spreads in the valley. Buyers came from 2 counties over for the orchard fruit. The grain went at top price 3 years running. Nelson and Briggs still drove past on their way to market. They did not stop. On a Tuesday morning in late September, Mabel came out to find Will on the porch steps working a stone from his boot sole, the yard loud with birds moving through the orchard. She handed him the cloth-wrapped bread for Heller's order, the good cloth, the one from the cedar chest. She did not save it any more. He took it, looked at her. He left the second boot alone, stood, and headed down the steps. He was already on the road when she turned back to the door. Behind the house, the sound of David at the pump, the long rhythmic clank of it, water coming up cold from the ground. She went inside and started the morning. And that was the story of Mabel and her son Will, and of the man who rode past their land on a Thursday morning and saw what everyone else had chosen not to see. Let me know in the comments if you enjoyed this one. Thank you.